I was standing in my backyard, surveying the damage from last night's storm, when I heard the diesel engine rumbling up my driveway. And my stomach dropped, because I hadn't called anyone to come out to my property in rural Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. The wind had torn half the roof off my 100-year-old barn, scattering weathered wood planks across 3 acres of pasture like matchsticks. It looked bad, sure, but it was my problem to deal with on my own timeline. The excavator rolled past my house without stopping, heading straight for the barn. I started jogging toward it, my boots squelching in the mud left by the storm. Behind the excavator came a white SUV with Meadowbrook Estates HOA emblazoned on the door. My jaw clenched. I'd bought this 5-acre property 2 years ago specifically because it was on the edge of the development, grandfathered in before the HOA rules got strict. The barn had been here since 1920, long before any housing development existed. "Hey, stop!" I shouted, waving my arms as I ran. The excavator operator, a weathered guy in a hard hat, looked down at me but didn't kill the engine. The SUV door opened and out stepped exactly who I expected: Patricia Carmichael, the HOA president. Mid-50s, blonde highlights that looked like they cost more than my truck payment, and that particular expression that said she thought she owned the world. "Mr. Richardson, please step back. This is official HOA business," Patricia said, holding up her hand like a traffic cop. She wore pressed khakis and a polo shirt with the HOA logo, like she was heading to a country club instead of trespassing on my property. "Official business. This is my property, Patricia. You can't just show up with heavy equipment." She pulled out a folder from her SUV, flipping through papers with practiced efficiency. According to Section 47B of the Meadowbrook Estates Guidelines, any structure deemed unsafe or unsightly must be addressed within 48 hours of notification. Your barn is both. "We sent you an email at 6 this morning." I pulled out my phone. Sure enough, there was an email I hadn't seen yet. "You sent an email 4 hours ago about a storm that happened 12 hours ago, and now you're here to demolish my barn, without talking to me in person, without giving me any real time to respond." The guidelines are clear. 48 hours to address or face HOA action. We're being generous by offering immediate remediation services. I didn't ask for your services, and you're not demolishing anything. I positioned myself between the excavator and the barn. The operator looked uncomfortable, glancing between Patricia and me. Patricia's expression hardened. "Mr. Richardson, you're in violation of our community standards. That structure is an eyesore and a safety hazard. We have every right to maintain property values in this development. This barn predates your development by 80 years. It's grandfathered in, and you know it. Grandfathered status doesn't mean you can maintain a hazardous structure. Our attorney reviewed this thoroughly." She turned to the operator. "Derek, proceed with the demolition." Derek shifted in his seat. "Madam, if he's saying not to, your company has a contract with the HOA. I suggest you honor it unless you want to face legal consequences." I held up my hand to Derek. "Don't move that machine. You'll be participating in criminal trespassing and property destruction." Then I turned back to Patricia. "You want to talk about legal consequences? I'm the district attorney for Lancaster County, and what you're attempting right now is illegal on about 5 different levels." The color drained from Patricia's face, but she recovered quickly. "That's very convenient to claim. I find it hard to believe." I pulled out my wallet and showed her my official identification. "James Richardson, Lancaster County District Attorney's Office." "You've got about 30 seconds to get that excavator off my property before I call the state police and have you arrested for criminal trespass and attempted destruction of property." Patricia's mouth opened and closed like a fish. The HOA has rights. We have bylaws. Your bylaws don't supersede state law, Patricia. You can't demolish someone's property without proper legal procedures. No court order, no condemnation hearing, nothing. You sent me an email this morning and showed up with a wrecking crew. That's not how any of this works. Derek was already backing the excavator away. Madam, I'm out. We're not getting involved in this. Your contract, Patricia started, doesn't cover illegal activity, Derek called down. Good luck, lady. The excavator rumbled back down the driveway, leaving deep ruts in my already torn-up lawn. Patricia stood there clutching her folder, red-faced. This isn't over. The barn is still in violation of community standards. We'll file the proper paperwork. You do that, and while you're at it, I'll be reviewing every action your HOA board has taken over the past few years. Because if you're willing to try something this egregious with me, I'm wondering what you've done to other homeowners who didn't have the resources to fight back. She got in her SUV and peeled out, spraying mud across my yard. I stood there for a moment, my heart still pounding with adrenaline. The barn loomed behind me, looking sad and broken with half its roof gone and timber beams exposed to the sky. I'd planned to fix it over the next few months, maybe by summer. It had been my workshop, my project space, where I restored old furniture and worked with my hands to decompress from the stress of prosecuting criminals all week. Now it was a war zone, and not just because of the storm. I pulled out my phone and called my office. My assistant, Rachel, picked up on the second ring. Hey boss, thought you were taking the morning off after the storm. Change of plans. I need you to pull everything we have on HOA law in Pennsylvania, and I need the files on any complaints we've received about Meadowbrook Estates HOA. Particularly anything involving Patricia Carmichael. Oh, what happened? She just tried to demolish my barn without permission, with an excavator, while I was standing in my backyard. Rachel whistled. She didn't know who you are. Oh, she does now. But I want to know if there's a pattern of behavior here. This feels too bold, too practiced. Like she's done this before. I'll pull everything. Want me to loop in Steve? Steve was our civil litigation specialist, handled cases that straddled the line between criminal and civil matters. Yeah, have him give me a call. I'm going to document everything here, take photos, gather evidence. If this goes where I think it might, I want to be thorough. I spent the next 2 hours photographing every inch of my barn, the excavator tracks in my driveway, the timeline of emails from the HOA. I documented the storm damage itself, making sure to note that while the structure needed repair, it wasn't in danger of imminent collapse. The roof was gone, but the frame and walls were solid. No risk to neighbors, no safety hazard beyond the normal don't go in a damaged building, common sense. My phone rang around 11. Steve from the office. James, Rachel filled me in. This is wild. Tell me about it. What do you know about HOA enforcement in Pennsylvania? More now than I did an hour ago. Short version, HOAs have some power, but they can't just demo your property. They'd need to get a court order, prove imminent danger, and even then, you'd have the right to appeal. What she tried to do is absolutely illegal. That's what I thought. What are my options here? Lots of them. You could file criminal charges for trespassing and attempted property destruction. You could sue civilly for damages, harassment, violation of your property rights. You could file a complaint with the state attorney general's office about HOA abuse, or you could do all of the above. I watched a blue jay land on what was left of my barn roof. What about investigating the HOA itself? If Patricia felt comfortable trying this with me, there have to be other victims. That's the prosecutor in you talking. I like it. You'd want to look at patterns of abuse, improper fines, illegal foreclosures. HOAs can technically foreclose on homes for unpaid fees, and some of them get aggressive about it. There have been cases across the country of HOAs abusing that power. Start digging, quietly. I don't want to tip them off that we're looking. You got it. And James, watch your back. HOA board members who get challenged tend to escalate. They're used to having unchecked power in their little kingdoms. He wasn't wrong. I'd seen it before. People who got a taste of authority and let it corrupt them completely. It didn't matter if you were running a corporation or a neighborhood association. Power attracted a certain type of personality. I went inside and made lunch, my mind churning through possibilities. My house was a modest 3-bedroom ranch, nothing fancy, but it had the land I wanted and the privacy I needed. The barn had sold me on the property. The previous owner had used it for horses, but I'd converted it into my personal space. Losing it would feel like losing a piece of myself. My phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. "This is Margaret Chen, your neighbor on Oak Street. Heard what happened with Patricia this morning. Can we talk?" I called the number. A woman answered immediately. "Mr. Richardson, thank you for calling back. I hope this isn't too forward, but my husband Bob and I heard about the incident with your barn. We wanted you to know you're not alone." "What do you mean?" "Patricia and the HOA board have been terrorizing homeowners for 2 years, ever since she became president. We've all been too scared to fight back because she's threatened foreclosures, liens, legal action. But if you're willing to stand up to her, we want to help." My prosecutor instincts kicked in. "Mrs. Chen, tell me everything." Margaret laid out a story that made my blood boil. Patricia had systematically targeted homeowners for minor violations, real or imagined. A mailbox painted the wrong shade of black. A fence 6 inches taller than the guidelines allowed. A garden shed that was too visible from the street. Each violation came with escalating fines, $50 a day until compliance. Many homeowners just paid, unable to afford legal help. Others made expensive modifications to satisfy Patricia's demands. "There's more," Margaret said. "About 6 months ago, Patricia went after the Johnsons on Maple Street. They had an old detached garage, needed some repair work. She declared it a hazard and got them to sign a consent form to have it removed. Except they didn't understand what they were signing. They thought it was just permission to inspect. 2 days later, a demolition crew showed up and tore the whole thing down before the Johnsons could stop them. Did they have anything valuable in the garage? Tools, equipment, family heirlooms they were storing, all destroyed. They tried to sue but couldn't afford an attorney. Patricia's lawyer buried them in paperwork until they gave up. What happened to them? They sold the house and moved, couldn't stand living here anymore. I made notes as she talked, filling page after page in my legal pad. "Mrs. Chen, would you and your husband be willing to make formal statements? And do you know other homeowners who'd be willing to talk?" "Absolutely. There's at least a dozen families who have had problems with Patricia. We've talked about it privately, but nobody wanted to be the first to stick their neck out. I'll organize a meeting, somewhere off HOA property, neutral ground. Can you help spread the word? Consider it done. Mr. Richardson, thank you. We've been feeling helpless for so long." After we hung up, I sat back and stared at my notes. This was bigger than my barn. This was systematic abuse of power, maybe even fraud and theft. Patricia hadn't just crossed a line with me. She'd been crossing it repeatedly with people who couldn't fight back. My phone rang again. Rachel from the office. "Boss, you need to hear this. I pulled complaints about Meadowbrook Estates HOA. We've got 4 formal complaints filed with our office over the past 18 months. all involving Patricia Carmichael and aggressive HOA enforcement. Why didn't these get escalated? They fell through the cracks. Minor civil disputes, complainants didn't follow up, no clear criminal activity. But looking at them together, there's definitely a pattern. Send me everything. I want names, dates, details. The rest of the day disappeared into research. I called the 4 complainants Rachel had found. 2 had moved away, still bitter about their experiences. 1 had paid thousands in fines just to get Patricia off their back. The last one, a retired veteran named Bill Murphy, still lived in Meadowbrook Estates and was eager to talk. "That woman is a tyrant," Bill said when I reached him. "I'm on a fixed income and she hit me with $500 in fines because my grass was too long after I had surgery. I was in the hospital, couldn't mow my lawn for 2 weeks. She didn't care, said the rules apply to everyone equally." "Did you pay the fines?" "Eventually. Couldn't afford not to. She threatened to foreclose on my house." "I'm 73 years old, Mr. Richardson. This is supposed to be my retirement, not a dictatorship." I arranged for Bill to come to the office and give a formal statement. Then I called a local restaurant, Tony's Italian Place on Route 30, and reserved their private room for tomorrow evening. Margaret Chen spread the word through the neighborhood, and by evening, I had confirmation from 15 homeowners who wanted to attend. That night, I sat on my back porch with a beer, staring at my ruined barn in the fading light. Storm clouds were building again on the horizon, another system moving through. I needed to get a tarp over what was left of the roof before more rain came, but I was too mentally exhausted to deal with it tonight. My ex-wife Karen would have loved this drama. She'd always said I needed to learn to relax, to not turn everything into a crusade. That's part of why we split up 3 years ago. She wanted someone who could leave work at work. I was someone who saw injustice and couldn't let it go. It's what made me good at my job and bad at relationships. But this time, it was personal and professional. Patricia had violated my rights, and apparently the rights of dozens of others. That wasn't something I could walk away from. The next morning, I called my insurance company to start a claim on the barn, then spent 4 hours getting a tarp secured over the damaged roof. My neighbor Tom from across the street came over to help, climbing the ladder with me and securing the heavy blue plastic against the wind. "Heard about Patricia's stunt yesterday," Tom said as we worked. "Glad you stopped her. That woman has caused nothing but grief since she took over the HOA." "You having problems with her too?" "Not yet, but I keep my head down and follow every rule to the letter. It's exhausting. I bought a house in a nice neighborhood, not a prison. By the time we finished, my shoulders ached and my hands were raw from handling rope. But the barn was protected from further weather damage, at least temporarily. I paid Tom in beer and pizza, then showered and headed to my office. The district attorney's office for Lancaster County was located in downtown Lancaster, a historic city with roots going back to colonial times. Our building was modern but designed to blend with the older architecture, all red brick and tall windows. I'd worked here for 12 years, the last 3 as the elected DA. Rachel had the files waiting on my desk. 4 official complaints, plus 24 documented calls and inquiries that hadn't risen to formal complaints. I read through each one, taking detailed notes. The pattern was clear. Patricia targeted vulnerable homeowners, overwhelmed them with aggressive enforcement and legal threats, then extracted money or compliance through intimidation. Steve knocked on my door around 2. "Got a minute, always. What did you find?" He sat down across from my desk, spreading out his own files. "Your HOA is a mess. I pulled their financial records, their public information. Patricia has been spending HOA funds on questionable legal fees, paying her attorney cousin over $5,000 a month for consulting services. The actual legal work doesn't justify that cost. That's embezzlement. Potentially. I also found 3 cases where the HOA foreclosed on homes for unpaid fines. All 3 happened in the past year. All 3 were elderly homeowners on fixed incomes. The HOA bought the properties at auction for pennies on the dollar, then immediately resold them at market value. My jaw clenched. They forced elderly people out of their homes to make a profit. Looks that way. It's technically legal if the fines were legitimate and proper procedures were followed. But given everything else you've told me, I'm betting those procedures weren't exactly by the book. I want a full investigation. Everything. Financial records, board meeting minutes, enforcement actions, legal procedures. If Patricia has been running this HOA like a criminal enterprise, I want to know. Steve nodded. I'll coordinate with the state ag's office. This could be bigger than just Lancaster County. HOA abuse is a statewide issue. That evening, I headed to Tony's Italian place. The private room was already filling up when I arrived. Margaret and Bob Chen introduced themselves in person, a nice couple in their 60s who'd lived in Meadowbrook Estates for 8 years. Bill Murphy was there with his wife Linda. And there were others, more than the 15 who'd confirmed. 23 homeowners in total, each with their own story of HOA abuse. I stood at the front of the room and waited for everyone to settle. Thank you all for coming. I know this is difficult, talking about these experiences. I want you to know that I believe you, and I'm committed to holding Patricia Carmichael and the HOA board accountable for what they've done. A woman in the back raised her hand. I'm Susan Fletcher. Patricia fined me $2,000 because she said my rose bushes were the wrong color. Wrong color. They were pink, not red, and apparently that violated some obscure guideline about approved plant colors. Others started sharing their stories. A man named David, whose fence was forcibly removed because it was allegedly 3 feet over the property line, except a survey he paid for proved it wasn't. A young couple, the Thompsons, who were threatened with foreclosure because their baby's toys were visible in the front yard. An elderly woman named Edith, who'd been cited for having the wrong brand of roof shingles after hail damage forced repairs. I took notes on everything, my anger building with each story. This wasn't just overzealous enforcement. This was targeted harassment and financial exploitation. Here's what I need from each of you, I said when everyone had shared. Formal written statements as detailed as possible. Every fine, every threat, every communication from Patricia or the HOA board. Copies of any documents you have, emails, letters, fine notices, everything. If you paid money to the HOA beyond normal dues, I need records of that. Bank statements, canceled checks, receipts. What are you going to do? Bob Chen asked. I'm going to investigate this as a potential criminal enterprise. HOA board members are in positions of trust. When they abuse that trust for personal gain, when they use intimidation and illegal tactics to extract money from homeowners, that's a crime. Multiple crimes, actually. Fraud, embezzlement, extortion, potentially elder abuse. The room erupted in hopeful chatter. These people had been living under Patricia's thumb for so long, they'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone on their side. Susan Fletcher raised her hand again. What about retaliation? If Patricia finds out we're all working with you, won't she come after us harder? She might try. But any retaliation now becomes additional evidence against her. Document everything going forward. If she sends you a fine notice, photograph it and send me a copy. If she shows up at your door, record the conversation if Pennsylvania law allows it, which it does with single-party consent. Don't engage, don't argue, just document and report to me. I gave everyone my direct cell number, something I rarely did, but this situation called for it. We spent another hour going through details, organizing the information, creating a timeline of Patricia's actions. By the time the meeting ended at 9:30, I had a comprehensive picture of 2 years of systematic abuse. Margaret Chen approached me as people were leaving. "Mr. Richardson, I can't thank you enough. We felt so alone in this. You're not alone anymore, and please call me James." "James, then. Can I ask you something personal? Why are you doing this? I mean, I know she tried to demolish your barn, but you could just handle that individual situation and move on. Why take on the whole HOA? I thought about my ex-wife's criticism, about being unable to let injustice go. Because it's the right thing to do. Because I have the power and position to fight back, and most people don't. Because if I don't stand up to bullies like Patricia, who will?" She squeezed my arm. "Your wife is a lucky woman. Divorced, actually. Apparently, I care more about justice than I do about work-life balance." I smiled to take the sting out of it. "Well, we're grateful for your dedication, even if your ex-wife wasn't." The drive home took me past the entrance to Meadowbrook Estates. The neighborhood was pretty, I had to admit. Tree-lined streets, well-maintained homes, neat lawns. From the outside, it looked like the American dream. But I knew now what lay beneath that pretty surface: fear, intimidation, and financial exploitation. My house was dark when I pulled in. The barn loomed against the night sky, the blue tarp flapping slightly in the breeze. I stood in my driveway for a moment, just looking at it. This building had become a symbol now, not just of my personal property rights, but of everyone who'd been victimized by Patricia's tyranny. The next morning, my office turned into a command center. Steve coordinated with the state attorney general's office. Rachel organized the statements coming in from homeowners, creating a database of complaints. I reached out to the Pennsylvania Department of State, which oversaw HOA regulations, and filed a formal complaint requesting an investigation. Then, I did something that would probably come back to bite me. I called Patricia Carmichael directly. She answered with her professional HOA voice. "Meadowbrook Estates, Patricia speaking." "Patricia, this is James Richardson. We need to talk." Her tone turned icy. "I have nothing to say to you, Mr. Richardson. My attorney has advised me not to communicate with you directly." "That's interesting, since I haven't filed any charges or lawsuits yet. But I am conducting an investigation into HOA practices in Meadowbrook Estates. I wanted to give you the courtesy of a heads-up." "Investigation? On what grounds?" "Fraud, embezzlement, elder abuse, extortion, and about a dozen other violations of Pennsylvania law. I've got 23 homeowners ready to testify about systematic harassment and illegal fee collection. I've got financial records showing questionable payments to your attorney cousin. And I've got 3 cases of potentially illegal foreclosures targeting elderly residents." Silence on the line. "Then, you can't prove any of that." "Actually, I can, and I will. Here's what's going to happen, Patricia. You're going to resign from the HOA board effective immediately. You're going to cease all enforcement actions against homeowners, and you're going to cooperate fully with the investigation. If you do those things, I might consider reducing the charges." "You're bluffing. The HOA has done nothing wrong. We've enforced the guidelines that all homeowners agreed to when they bought their properties. Enforcing legitimate rules is fine. Using your position to harass and financially exploit vulnerable people is not. The choice is yours, Patricia. Resign and cooperate, or fight this and face the full weight of criminal prosecution." She hung up on me. I'd expected that. People like Patricia didn't back down easily. They'd spent too long believing they were untouchable. Over the next week, I continued building the case. More homeowners came forward, including several who'd moved out of Meadowbrook Estates, but still carried the financial and emotional scars of Patricia's enforcement actions. The state ag's office assigned an investigator, a sharp woman named Diana Patel who specialized in consumer fraud cases. Diana and I met at a coffee shop in downtown Lancaster. She had a tablet full of notes and a grim expression. "Your HOA president is a piece of work," Diana said. "I've been reviewing the financial records. She's been skimming money for 2 years. The attorney consulting fees are just the tip of it. She's been billing the HOA for property management services her own company provides at inflated rates. She's been taking kickbacks from contractors, and those 3 foreclosures. She personally bought all 3 properties through a shell company, then resold them. She made over $300,000 in profit." I whistled low. "That's beyond HOA abuse. That's straight-up fraud and embezzlement. It gets worse." I found evidence that she falsified some of the violations she cited homeowners for. Photos that were edited to make damage look worse than it was. Measurements that were deliberately wrong. She created violations to justify fines, and when homeowners couldn't pay the escalating fees, she'd move toward foreclosure. She was manufacturing crises to steal people's homes. Exactly. And here's the kicker. Her 2 fellow board members, Greg Whitmore and Sandra Burke, they knew about it. They were in on the scheme. Greg's construction company got all the demolition and repair contracts, always at above market rates. Sandra runs a real estate agency and listed all the foreclosed properties, taking her commission both times. This was bigger than I'd imagined. Patricia hadn't been acting alone. The entire HOA board was corrupt. "What do you need from me?" I asked. "Keep gathering victim statements. I'm going to need a warrant to seize HOA records and personal financial documents from all 3 board members. Can you get me in front of a judge?" "I can have a warrant on your desk by tomorrow morning." Judge Raymond Kowalski was a no-nonsense jurist who'd been on the bench for 20 years. He reviewed our warrant application with his typical thoroughness, asking pointed questions about probable cause and the scope of documents we wanted to seize. "This is quite an operation," Judge Kowalski said. 3 board members running a long-term fraud scheme through an HOA. "You don't see that every day." "Unfortunately, Your Honor, I think we see it more than we realize. Most victims don't have the resources to fight back." He signed the warrant. "Take them down, James. HOAs serve important functions, but this kind of corruption gives them all a bad name." Diana executed the warrant the following Tuesday with help from Pennsylvania State Police. I stayed back, knowing my presence would look like personal retaliation for the barn incident. But I got updates throughout the day. Patricia's home office yielded boxes of documents showing the full extent of the fraud. Bank records, contractor agreements, emails coordinating with Greg and Sandra. The digital trail was even better. Patricia had kept detailed spreadsheets tracking her illicit profits, apparently too arrogant to think anyone would ever see them. Greg Whitmore's construction office had files showing inflated bids and kickback payments. Sandra Burke's real estate office had documents proving she knew the foreclosures were based on manufactured violations. By Wednesday afternoon, Diana had enough evidence to file criminal charges against all 3 board members. I reviewed the charges with my team: fraud, embezzlement, theft by deception, elder abuse, conspiracy, and abuse of fiduciary duty. Each charge carried significant prison time. Thursday morning, Pennsylvania State Police arrested Patricia Carmichael at her home. Greg Whitmore was arrested at a construction site, led away in handcuffs in front of his crew. Sandra Burke turned herself in after her attorney called, trying to negotiate a deal before arrest. I watched from my office as the news spread through Lancaster County. The local newspaper ran it as their front-page story. HOA board arrested in massive fraud scheme. TV news crews camped outside the courthouse. My phone rang constantly with interview requests. I declined most interviews, not wanting this to look like personal revenge. But I did speak with the county newspaper, emphasizing that this was about protecting homeowners and holding corrupt officials accountable. The victims in this case are people who bought homes in good faith, expecting to live peacefully in a well-maintained neighborhood, I told the reporter. Instead, they were targeted by board members who saw them as profit opportunities. This prosecution sends a message that HOA board members are not above the law. The arraignment was Friday morning. All three defendants appeared before Judge Kowalski with their attorneys. Patricia looked diminished somehow, her usual confidence replaced by pale-faced shock. Greg appeared angry, jaw clenched as the charges were read. Sandra cried quietly, mascara running down her face. The Attorney General's office handled the prosecution, with Diana Patel as lead counsel. I stayed in the gallery, there to support the victims who'd come to watch. Margaret and Bob Chen sat behind me. Bill Murphy was there with his wife. Susan Fletcher and the Thompsons and Edith, and so many others whose lives had been upended by Patricia's greed. Bail was set at $50,000 each. Patricia and Greg posted it immediately. Sandra remained in custody, unable to afford the bond. Outside the courthouse, Margaret hugged me. "Thank you. I know you say you're just doing your job, but this means everything to us. It's not over yet. We've got a long way to go before trial. But at least now we have hope. We're not powerless anymore." Over the next few weeks, the case continued building. More homeowners came forward, expanding our victim count to 47 families. The financial damages exceeded $800,000. Diana worked with the state attorney general to also file civil forfeiture actions, seizing Patricia's illegally gained assets to eventually repay victims. My barn became something of a symbol. The local news ran a story about how the attempted demolition had exposed the entire fraud scheme. "One man's barn brings down corrupt HOA" was the headline. It felt grandiose, but I understood the appeal of the narrative. I hired a contractor to properly repair the barn, using my insurance money and some savings. It would take months, but the old structure would survive. Like the homeowners of Meadowbrook Estates, it had weathered the storm and would be rebuilt stronger than before. The preliminary hearings happened in July, hot summer days when the courthouse air conditioning struggled to keep up. Diana methodically presented evidence, financial records, victim testimony, emails and documents proving the conspiracy. Patricia's attorney tried to argue that aggressive HOA enforcement wasn't a crime, but the judge wasn't buying it. "Counselor, your client didn't just enforce rules," Judge Kowalski said. "She manufactured violations, extracted illegal fees, and foreclosed on homes to steal equity. That's not enforcement, that's fraud." All three defendants were bound over for trial. Sandra Burke's attorney reached out about a plea deal. She was willing to testify against Patricia and Greg in exchange for reduced charges. Diana and I discussed it with our team. She was definitely involved, but she was also the least culpable, Diana argued. Patricia ran the operation. Greg was her main co-conspirator. Sandra facilitated but didn't initiate. What's she offering? Full cooperation, complete testimony, and financial restitution. She's already liquidated assets to start paying back victims. We offered Sandra a deal: plead guilty to conspiracy and fraud, testify truthfully, cooperate fully, and we'd recommend a sentence of probation with restitution. She took it immediately. Patricia and Greg held out, believing they could win at trial. Their attorneys filed motions to suppress evidence, to dismiss charges, to separate trials. Judge Kowalski denied every motion. The trial started in September, crisp fall days with leaves turning gold and red across Lancaster County. The courthouse was packed every day with media, curious observers, and most importantly, the victims. Diana's opening statement laid out the scheme clearly. For 2 years, these defendants treated Meadowbrook Estates like their personal ATM. They manufactured violations, imposed illegal fines, and foreclosed on homes to steal equity. They preyed on elderly residents, on young families, on anyone they thought couldn't fight back. They abused positions of trust for personal profit. And they did it all behind the legitimate-sounding facade of an HOA enforcing community standards. Patricia's attorney argued in response that she'd simply been a diligent HOA president enforcing bylaws that all homeowners had agreed to. Aggressive enforcement isn't a crime. My client believed she was protecting property values and maintaining community standards. Any profit she made was coincidental, not criminal. Greg's attorney took a different approach, arguing that as a contractor, he'd simply bid on jobs offered by the HOA. Mr. Whitmore's construction company did quality work at fair prices. The prosecution is attempting to criminalize normal business practices. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Deanna called victim after victim to testify. Bill Murphy described being threatened with foreclosure while recovering from surgery. The Johnsons, who'd since moved to Ohio, flew back to testify about their demolished garage and destroyed possessions. An elderly widow named Martha described how Patricia had fined her $6,000 for violations that didn't actually exist, then threatened to take her home when she couldn't pay. The financial expert testimony was damning. A forensic accountant walked the jury through Patricia's scheme step by step, showing how money flowed from homeowners to the HOA to Patricia's various companies and accounts. The charts and graphs made it impossible to claim the profits were coincidental. Sandra Burke's testimony sealed it. She described meetings where Patricia and Greg planned which homeowners to target, how much to fine them, and when to move toward foreclosure. She admitted her own participation and expressed remorse. "I knew it was wrong," Sandra said on the stand, tears streaming down her face. But Patricia was so confident, so sure we'd never get caught. She said homeowners never fought back because they couldn't afford attorneys. She said we were just taking advantage of a system that already favored HOAs. I went along with it because I was making money, and I'm ashamed of that. Patricia's attorney tried to paint Sandra as a liar trying to save herself, but the documentary evidence supported everything she said. Emails, text messages, financial records, all of it corroborating her testimony. I testified about the barn incident, describing how Patricia had showed up with an excavator to demolish my property without permission or legal authority. Her attorney tried to suggest I was prosecuting her out of personal revenge. "Mr. Richardson, isn't it true that you filed these charges because you were angry about the attempted barn demolition?" "I filed charges because I uncovered evidence of systematic fraud and abuse. The barn incident revealed what Patricia was willing to do. The investigation revealed what she had been doing for years. But you have a personal stake in this case. I have a personal stake in every case I prosecute. I live in Lancaster County. These are my neighbors, my community. When someone commits crimes here, particularly crimes targeting vulnerable residents. I take that personally. But the evidence speaks for itself. This isn't about my barn. It's about 47 families who were victimized by a corrupt HOA board. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous on all counts for both Patricia and Greg. Guilty across the board. Patricia's face crumpled when the verdict was read. Greg stared straight ahead, jaw tight. Their attorneys immediately filed notice of appeal, but everyone knew it was just procedure. The evidence had been overwhelming. Sentencing was scheduled for November. In the meantime, the civil cases moved forward. Victims filed lawsuits to recover damages. The state attorney general's office worked to dissolve the existing HOA board and establish new leadership with proper oversight. A special auditor was appointed to review all HOA finances and ensure no other schemes remained hidden. I spent an afternoon at Tony's Italian place again, this time for a celebration with the Meadowbrook Estates homeowners. The private room was packed with families sharing food and stories, the atmosphere lighter than I'd ever seen it. Margaret Chen raised a glass. To James Richardson, who stood up when we couldn't, who used his power to protect instead of exploit, who reminded us that the system can work when good people refuse to accept injustice. Everyone cheered. I felt embarrassed by the attention but also deeply satisfied. This was why I'd become a prosecutor, for moments exactly like this. Bill Murphy approached me later. I got a letter from the restitution fund. I'm getting back the $500 Patricia fined me plus interest. It's not a fortune, but it's the principle that matters. Someone actually held her accountable. You all deserved better from the start. I'm just glad we could make it right. The sentencing hearing in November was packed. Judge Kowalski allowed victim impact statements, and 23 people spoke. Their words were powerful, describing not just financial harm but emotional damage, stress, fear, the feeling of helplessness against Patricia's campaign. Martha, the elderly widow, spoke with quiet dignity. I'm 81 years old. I bought my home in Meadowbrook Estates hoping to live out my remaining years in peace. Instead, I lived in constant fear that Patricia would take my home away. I stopped sleeping well. I stopped enjoying my garden because I was afraid I'd plant the wrong flowers. She stole 2 years of peace from me, and I can never get that back. When it was time for Patricia to speak, she stood and read from a prepared statement. I apologize to anyone who felt harmed by my actions as HOA president. I always believed I was acting in the community's best interest. I realize now that my enforcement approach was too aggressive. I never intended to cause distress. It was a calculated non-apology, admitting nothing, accepting no real responsibility. Judge Kowalski saw right through it. Miss Carmichael, you've shown no genuine remorse. You've maintained throughout this process that you were simply doing your job as HOA president. But the evidence showed something very different. You ran a criminal enterprise. You targeted vulnerable people systematically. You stole homes from elderly residents. You manufactured violations to justify illegal fines. And you did it all for personal profit without regard for the harm you caused. He sentenced Patricia to 8 years in state prison, plus full restitution to all victims. Greg got 6 years. Sandra, who'd cooperated, received 3 years of probation and a suspended sentence, along with her restitution obligations. Patricia's attorney immediately filed an appeal, but it would take months or years to resolve, and she'd remain in custody pending the appeal outcome. Outside the courthouse, the news crews swarmed for statements. This time I agreed to speak, wanting to send a clear message. This case demonstrates that no one is above the law, regardless of their position or authority. HOA board members serve in positions of trust. When they abuse that trust, they face consequences. I hope this prosecution serves as a warning to other HOA boards who might be tempted to exploit their power, and I hope it encourages homeowners to speak up when they see abuse. You're not powerless. The system can work, but only if people are willing to stand up for what's right. A reporter asked, "What about your barn? How's the repair work going?" I smiled. "It's almost finished, actually. Should be done by Christmas. It's going to be stronger than ever." By December, life had started returning to normal. The barn restoration was in its final stages, the new roof gleaming in the winter sun. The contractor had done beautiful work, preserving the historic character while modernizing the structure to meet current safety standards. It had been expensive even with insurance, but worth it to save the old building. The Meadowbrook Estates HOA had elected a new board, homeowners who'd been victims of Patricia's scheme. Their first acts were to eliminate many of the petty rules Patricia had enforced, reduce fees, and establish transparent financial oversight. The neighborhood was healing. Margaret Chen called me on a cold December afternoon. "James, we're having a neighborhood holiday party. We'd love for you to come. It's our first real celebration in years, and we wouldn't be here without you." I almost declined, uncomfortable being the center of attention, but these people had become friends through shared struggle. They deserved to celebrate. The party was at the community center in Meadowbrook Estates, decorated with lights and garland. Kids ran around hyped up on cookies and candy. Adults chatted and laughed. The atmosphere relaxed in a way it hadn't been when Patricia ran things. Bill Murphy gave me a firm handshake. "Good to see you, James. How's the barn?" "Ready for me to start building furniture again. I've got a backlog of projects to catch up on." "Well, when you've got time, I'd love to commission a piece. Something to remember all this by. Maybe a cabinet or a bookshelf. I'd be honored." Susan Fletcher approached with her husband. "James, we wanted you to know we're staying. After everything with Patricia, we'd considered selling and leaving. But with the new board, with the changes happening, Meadowbrook Estates feels like home again." That comment meant more than all the praise and thanks. These families were staying, rebuilding their community, reclaiming the neighborhood Patricia had corrupted. That was the real victory. As the party wound down, I stood outside looking at the houses decorated with Christmas lights. This was a good neighborhood, full of good people who'd been victimized by someone who should have protected them. But they'd found the courage to fight back, and together we'd held the abusers accountable. My phone buzzed with an email from Diana Patel. "Wanted you to know Patricia's appeal was denied at the first level. She's exhausted her initial appeals. Looks like she'll be serving the full sentence." I typed back, "Good, justice served." Driving home that night, I passed my barn, now fully restored and lit by the motion sensor lights I'd installed. It looked solid and strong, exactly as it had before the storm, but somehow better. Renewed. The attempted demolition felt like a lifetime ago, though it had only been 8 months. In that time, we'd exposed a criminal conspiracy, prosecuted corrupt officials, recovered funds for victims, and reformed an abusive HOA. We'd reminded people that they had power, that the system could work, that standing up to bullies mattered. Karen, my ex-wife, had been wrong about one thing. She'd said my need to fight every injustice would leave me alone and bitter. But standing in my yard that December night, my barn restored, and my neighbors celebrating their reclaimed community, I didn't feel alone. I felt connected to something larger than myself, part of a community that had faced darkness together and emerged stronger. The barn stood as a reminder, not just of Patricia's attempted abuse, but of resilience, of the importance of standing up when it would be easier to back down, of using whatever power and privilege you had to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. I went inside and poured a bourbon, raising the glass in a silent toast to my barn, to my neighbors, to justice served. Tomorrow I'd go back to the office and continue prosecuting criminals, protecting my community, standing up for what was right. Because that's what I did, who I was, and I wouldn't have it any other way. The following months brought closure to various threads. The restitution fund distributed over $600,000 to victims. Money recovered from Patricia's seized assets and garnished wages from Greg's business holdings. Several families used their recovered funds to make improvements they'd been putting off, no longer living in fear of HOA retaliation for every small change. The new HOA board established regular town halls, transparent financial reporting, and reasonable enforcement guidelines. They created an appeals process for violations, ensuring no homeowner could be railroaded by a tyrannical board member. Meadowbrook Estates became a model for HOA reform across Pennsylvania. The state legislature took notice. A representative from Lancaster reached out about drafting new HOA oversight legislation. I testified before a committee about the abuses we'd uncovered, recommending mandatory audits, limits on enforcement powers, and clearer appeals processes for homeowners. HOAs serve important functions, I told the committee. They maintain common areas, enforce reasonable standards, and preserve property values. But they're also prone to abuse because homeowners often don't understand their rights and board members face minimal oversight. We need better protections built into the system. The resulting legislation, House Bill 847, passed in March and was signed into law in April. It required annual independent audits for HOAs over a certain size, established clear limits on fines and enforcement actions, mandated appeals processes, and created a state hotline for reporting HOA abuse. Homeowner advocates called it the most significant HOA reform in Pennsylvania history. I didn't do it for recognition, but the Lancaster County Bar Association gave me their Public Service Award that spring. Standing at the podium accepting it, I saw the faces of people from Meadowbrook Estates in the audience. That meant more than any trophy. My barn workshop was fully operational again by spring. I spent weekends there working on Bill Murphy's commissioned bookshelf, a large piece in quarter-sawn oak with hand-cut dovetails. The physical work was meditative, a counterbalance to the mental intensity of prosecution work. Bill came by one Saturday to check on progress. "It's beautiful, James, really beautiful. It's getting there. Should be done in a few weeks." He ran his hand over the smooth wood. "You know, when Patricia was threatening to take my house, I felt powerless. I'm a veteran, served 2 tours in Vietnam. I've faced down enemy fire. But this 70-something woman with a clipboard made me feel helpless. That's what bullies do, I guess. They find your vulnerabilities and exploit them. You weren't helpless. You just needed someone to stand with you. That's what you did. Stood with us when you could have just handled your own barn situation and moved on. That took character. After he left, I thought about that idea of standing with people versus standing alone. My ex-wife had accused me of being a lone crusader, fighting battles no one asked me to fight. But the Meadowbrook Estates situation proved that wrong. People wanted someone to stand with them. They'd been fighting alone for so long, isolated and scared. All I'd done was give them a focal point, a way to channel their individual struggles into collective action. That summer, Lancaster County was beautiful. The storm damage from the previous year had been repaired across the region. New growth filled in where trees had fallen. Communities rebuilt stronger than before. I got word that Patricia had been transferred to a state prison in western Pennsylvania, where she'd serve the remainder of her sentence. Her appeals had been exhausted, all her legal maneuvering unsuccessful. The justice system had worked slowly but thoroughly. Greg had actually been released early for good behavior, though his construction business had collapsed. He'd left Pennsylvania, moving south somewhere, trying to rebuild his life away from the wreckage of his crimes. I heard he was working as a regular construction crew member, no longer running his own company, his contractor's license revoked. Sandra had completed her probation and was working at a bank, no longer in real estate. She'd paid her full restitution and apparently tried to make amends with former neighbors. Some forgave her, others didn't. That was their right. The homeowners of Meadowbrook Estates moved on with their lives, but they stayed connected, bonded by shared trauma and recovery. They started a neighborhood watch program, organized community events, and created a support network for elderly residents. The crisis had brought them together in ways prosperity never had. On the anniversary of that September morning when Patricia tried to demolish my barn, I stood in my workshop surrounded by sawdust and the smell of fresh wood. The barn had been restored, better than before. The neighborhood had been reformed, stronger than before. Justice had been served, thorough and complete. My phone rang. Rachel from the office. "Hey boss, got a call from a homeowner in Chester County. Says their HOA is threatening to foreclose over disputed fines. Claims it's very similar to the Meadowbrook Estates situation. Wants to know if you can help." I looked around my workshop at the projects in various stages of completion, at the peaceful space I'd created for myself. I thought about work-life balance, about knowing when to step back, about not turning everything into a crusade. Then I thought about Bill Murphy being threatened while recovering from surgery, about Martha's stolen piece, about the Johnsons' demolished garage and destroyed heirlooms, about Patricia's systematic victimization of vulnerable people who couldn't fight back alone. "Get me their contact information," I said. "Let's see what's going on." Because that's who I was, someone who stood with people when they needed it, someone who used his position and power to protect rather than exploit. Someone who believed that justice mattered, that standing up to bullies was worth the effort, that one person could make a difference by refusing to accept injustice. The barn stood behind me as I made that call, solid and restored, a testament to resilience and the importance of fighting back. Patricia had tried to tear it down, just as she tried to tear down the lives of dozens of families. But we'd all survived, rebuilt, come back stronger, and we'd do it again as many times as necessary, for as long as bullies existed and people needed someone to stand with them. That was enough. That was everything.